About 14 years ago, my wife and I moved from Vancouver, Washington to Pullman, and we packed up our U-Haul truck and we put everything in it. It took us about 2.5 days to pack, and we arrived in Pullman, Washington. And as we arrived, as we pulled up into our house, we were greeted there by 40 people. And it was just this kind of overwhelming moment. And they were there to unpack our U-Haul truck with all of our stuff. And the house that we moved into at that point had had been neglected very poorly or very badly in terms of the front yard. So we pulled our truck right up to the front door. Like the ramp went into the front door. Like just kind of how that could happen. And in the next 25 minutes, all these 40 people began to unload this vehicle and unload our truck and put it into our house. And like, it probably shouldn't have taken them 25 minutes, but we had a bunch of junk. And so it's like, hey, please be careful with that. The leg is gonna fall off. Kind of furniture, if you've ever had that kind of stuff that was really just college furniture, but now you're married and you still have the stuff. And so this is kind of that, hey, this couch is gonna fall apart if you don't gently take this into this place. And then just random stuff. I remember I had scrap lumber that I decided to move. I just thought, I might use this. So scrap lumber, these guys were like, what's this for? Does this go to something? I was like, no, but it could. So just random, but it took them 25 minutes to do this. And I remember having a conversation with my next door neighbor. He was an engineering professor, electrical engineering professor. My first conversation, he was like, what was that? And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, it took me and my wife 2.5 days to unpack our truck when we moved into, and they had the exact same house. I mean, on my street, it's all the exact same house, right? It took me 2.5 days to unload our truck, and I was like, it's our church. And I remember the moment where he began to just look at this and begin to see, oh my goodness, like this is radically different. And so this idea that began with my neighbor began to repeatedly help me to understand that what we begin to do when we begin to live towards each other in the context of community is profoundly just awe-inspiring, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense and he said, how many of those people do you know? I said, 2. I know 2 out of the 40 people. And he's like, so those weren't your friends? I was like, no, that's my church. And this is when we begin to think about what this looks like, and as we begin to process this whole series about how do we begin to live out towards each other, we begin to see in the Bible these things that happen over and over, these one another statements, and it begins to help us to understand. So Jesus says to his followers, he says, I'm going to build, to 12 guys, I'm gonna build this thing called a church, and nothing's gonna be able to overcome it. And as we talked about how you begin to think about these guys that are looking to each other and begin to say, how is this going to be something that we begin to build? And he's like, I'm going to build it through you. And what the things that we begin to understand is that oftentimes when we begin to live towards these one another's, when we begin to live towards these commands, that people outside of us, they may disagree with what we believe, but they are drawn to the way that we treat each other. And the thing that Jesus created and the thing that he built was something that has withstood the last 2,000 years and began to go from 12 people to billions of people that begin to do this because these one another's begin to create a foundation of community that is significantly different than anything else that we see in the world. And I want to push into this specifically today in the idea of what does it look like for us to serve each other, and what does it look like for us to be able to understand how we live this out. And so here's where I wanted to explore Galatians 5. Galatians 5 gives us one of those one another's. It gives us the place where we begin to understand this. And as we begin to press into this, my hope for us is that we begin to even have a brand new way to be able to understand how we live towards each other and how it profoundly affects our lives and begins to reveal Jesus in a very tangible way to the world around us. So here's where we start. In verse 13, chapter 5, it says this, you, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command, love your neighbor as yourself. And so what you begin to see here is this really fascinating reality. This fascinating reality of what it looks like for us to serve one another. And for this to be one of the things that we begin to understand is how we interact with each other. But the primary thing, I think, to begin to get to that place where we understand that word serve is to understand the context of relationship that we're meant to be in towards each other. And so let's go back to this and begin to try to understand this phrase. He begins, and ultimately we begin to see how all of this begins to play out in Galatians 5. And Galatians 5 goes from the idea of how you are to live in the Spirit all the way down at the very end of Galatians 5. We begin to have really Paul unpack what we call the fruit of the Spirit. Or, say love, gentleness, patience, kindness, all of this stuff that begins to say, hey, this is when you're living out of the Spirit of God in you. This is what it looks like individually. But he begins this whole statement to be able to understand how we live towards each other corporately. And what's this community look like? And the fascinating thing is this phrase that he uses, you, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free. Now, I think it's easy for us sometimes just to pass over the terminology that we have here, to pass over this idea that we begin to see in terms of the usage of brother and sister. And in this context, I want you to understand the biological, the nuclear family in this aspect of life, in this time, in this space, in this culture, was one by which your entire identity was understood in terms of your family. In terms of the family, in terms of your biological and nuclear family, that you begin to understand, hey, my economic reality is determined by my family, not just now, but likely for the rest of my life, because I'm probably going to take over what my family has done for generations, and that's going to be one of the things that is a key identifier. And so when we begin to see this, that's one of those realities, is that my identity, it's different from where we are today, where we begin to say, hey, you can be whatever you want to be. That may be a part of your family's history. It may be you choosing something completely different, but you can actually remove yourself from that. And that just wasn't the case. Not only that, in terms of geography, in terms of how most people lived, the way by which they moved locations was typically not because they wanted to, but because some sort of an economic reality or some sort of a reality of being taken as slaves, as being conquered people, and then to be removed from that. That's typically how people begin to actually move and transition. And this is how they would understand themselves. And so the idea of the nuclear family, even as significant as it is today, was more so at that time in that location. And so when we begin to see this reality, that the usage of the word brothers and sisters, and some of you guys have come from a church background, and this is one of those things that you may have heard before. And our staff, sometimes we joke about using brother before all kinds of, crazy names, so brother this and brother that, but that's a historical church kind of thing, right? And then if you grew up in maybe a Catholic background, the leader of that, the priest, was you would call them father. And so these terms get used in our context, and if you have some sort of a background, if you don't have any church background and you begin to hear people call each other brother and sister that are not brother and sister, then it begins to be really weird, right? And you're like, why are you calling each other this, Or you read in the text and say brothers and sisters, and it doesn't make any sense. Here's what I want us to get, is that the context for us to understand the idea of service has to start with the understanding that we have in terms of, do we believe each other to be a part of a family that is beyond biology, but in terms of being able to be connected to our spirituality. And so what Jesus does is not only in this Pauline, but Jesus uses the same idea. He uses biological family terms to describe a spiritual family. Now what's happened is because we've used this, either it's strange to you or it's normative to you. If you have a church background, it's probably normative. If you don't, it's probably a bit strange, and someone had to explain this to you. Either way, I think as we begin to actually say, what does it look like for us in our relationships with those who are in some sort of a spiritual orbit in our life, but are not a part of our family? How are we acting towards those people? How do we begin to understand our relationship to that group of people? And this is the thing that I think oftentimes we miss as the understanding of the motivation to serve, or really the motivation for many of these each others, is that we begin to believe, as Jesus believed, that when we begin to enter into a spiritual family, that what happens in this is that we begin to mimic the realities that we would typify in a biological or nuclear family. That we begin to understand the way that we live towards each other, the commitment that we have towards each other begins to mirror that we would see in a healthy family. Now, I know that we all don't come from healthy families, and there's moments where you would say, I mean, I don't want this to look anything like. I'm trying to escape my biological family. That was a negative thing. So I want us to think through, we all probably have a mindset of saying, hey, what would a healthy family look like? And either that would be an aspirational thing, or we would go back and have memories of saying, hey, this is what healthy would look like. And so here's what we begin to see, is that the body of Christ, as we begin to say, okay, there's a common factor in our connectedness to Christ that brings us into a connectedness with each other. And the level of connectedness that we are to have with each other would be one by which would typify the connection and commitment to a nuclear or biological family. And we all have this like dichotomy between this. Like, I think what would be typical is like, hey, if I have a small or singular ask, or I have something I need to say, okay, would you do me a favor? Then in that range, we might be able to have, hey, I have my friends to be able to ask. But if it gets to be something that is significant, or something that is, hard, or something that is long, we begin to have this mentality of transitioning over to the idea that's only things that I can ask my family. And so what happens is when we begin to play this out, we begin to dichotomize between the understanding of what we would ask of a family in a healthy context, what we'd ask of a family member, and what we would ask of our community in Christ, or our friendships, right? And unless you have like really deep-rooted friendships, typically you would say those are different asks. I would ask one thing here and I would ask another thing there, because these people are committed to me. Like these people, I have this history, I have this, but what we begin to see is the beauty of this reality that God brings us together. And what we begin to see is the reconstitution of family, not around the fact that we have a common DNA or a common nuclear connection together, but we have a father that brings us together, and that's a spiritual father. And what happens in that is that we begin to see the kind of commitment and the kind of connection to each other that really is something that doesn't make sense outside of an understanding of being people who are in a spiritual family. And so what happens is that the standard of a healthy family is now the standard of true spiritual community, that we begin to see this is the new standard. And this is how we begin to have health around mission. Because when we begin to think about how we are to take and understand, hey, we're going to take the gospel and we're going to go to different aspects, and we're going to be able to do this in a way that sometimes is difficult in the world around us. But when we begin to have the commitment to one another, we begin to have this reconstitution of family. And so, I mean, one of the things that is so difficult is when you begin to have biological parents begin to say, I don't want you to live on mission because of what it's going to cost for you to be away from me. Or we begin to say, I don't want to go because that's going to take me away from my family. And what's said there is not my spiritual family, but my biological family. I don't want to do this. This is too big of a cost because of what it's going to happen, what it's going to do to affect my biological family. And so I'm meddling here, I know, but to press us forward, to be able to say, hey, there's this reality that when we begin to understand that God has created a new family, and this is what Jesus says over and over, who are my brothers, who are my sisters? This is those things that we begin to understand. Jesus's thought is that what it looks like for us to live on mission and to do that in a healthy context where we're not only just thinking about what we leave, but what we gain, is for us to be able to understand that there's a reconstitution of a new family. And I want you to know, for those of you who've planted churches, you've begun to taste what it looks like. For those of you who've gone off, you begin to taste of what it looks like to begin to rely on people to such a degree that you would say, this is more similar to family than any other relationship. And what we begin to find in that is when we're forced into these moments of saying, I've got to rely on you, that there's a door that gets open to the kind of community that we possess that begins to say the amount of depth that I could have in my life is not determined by the amount of biological connections that I have, but now I have this depth that I could have in my friendships that has so much greater numbers of the opportunities to be able to say, I could be connected to so many people. And again, what we're doing is we're fighting against isolation, and we're fighting against the loneliness that is permeating our societies, that is permeating Resonate Church. That there's way too many people that are operating in isolation and no one really knows me, and I'm not sure if anybody really likes me, and I'm not really sure if I have these deep friendships. And for us to be able to say, this is what it looks like, it begins to open our hearts to be able to say, I'm gonna start using the phrase brother and sister. You don't have to, but you have to think about people in terms of being open to having those kind of connections. And so here's what we begin to see, is that when we understand that, it helps us to understand the rest of the text. And so he says this, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh, rather serve each other humbly in love. So what he does is he dichotomizes with this understanding. If we begin to say, okay, this is what it's gonna look like for me to live towards the people around me as if we're connected in Christ at the level of a biological family connection or nuclear family connection. Therefore, it gives us an understanding of how we are to serve and how we are to sacrifice for each other. And he says there's two options here. One, you can use this to indulge yourself, or you can use this to serve. That there's two options when we begin to understand how we begin to see our motivations to the world. So you have two things that you begin to see in the world. Either you're looking to the world for indulgence, or you're looking for people to be able to say, how do I get to use those people for my benefit? Or you look to those people to say, how do I serve those benefit? How do I serve those people? And how do I benefit them? And this is a fascinating reality as we begin to see this progression and we begin to understand how we're to live this thing out. And so I wanted to try to give a little bit more handles to this and to be able to understand this idea that Paul unpacks in Galatians and to be able to say, what does it look like for us to see this indulgent versus service kind of thing? And I want you to get how Paul is brilliant in this and how he's helping us to understand how we're to live and how we begin to see even modern day these same things beginning to help us to understand how we live, work, and play together and what are the dynamics of our motivation. So there's a guy named Adam Grant, and Adam Grant wrote a book called Give and Take. And this book, Give and Take, is brilliant. He does all this research on how we interact with each other and actually how we take this principle and how it begins to live out in our world. And so he begins to say, he's a social psychologist, and he speaks mostly to people who are operating in the workplace. And he begins to see these things happen. And we begin to see, hey, there's kind of these different kinds of people in the workplace, and they have these different motivations. And these different motivations begin to dichotomize kind of how they live out their lives and begin to tell them how they're going to ultimately be productive, how they're going to get ahead in work and in family. And so he writes this book called Give and Take. And so let me give you basically the gist of this. He said there's three different kinds of people. One, there's the taker. The taker are those who work towards getting as much as possible from every transaction. These are the primary way that they begin to see the world is, how can I get something out of this? So in relationships, typically in business transactions, in social situations, they begin to say, how do I begin to get something out of this? They're looking for the angle of how they get things out. And he says, here's the thing. Research says that takers are successful. That oftentimes, in terms of being able to see the span of things, that takers end up typically being people that have a significant amount of success. Why? Because they're strategizing how to begin to get ahead from other people. He said there's also a different kind of person. This person is, these are called the givers. And these are people who go out of their way to help others, but without expecting anything in return. Without is key there. Those who go out of their way to help others without expecting anything in return. And so these are those people who begin to say, hey, my orientation is to figure out how I can help you. And what is so deeply ingrained in my values and motivations is really how you get ahead, not necessarily how I get ahead. And so when I hear a need, and oftentimes givers are very attuned to the needs of the people around them, they begin to say, hey, how can I help? How can I be a part of helping meet your need, or helping help solve this problem, or help you to get to where you need to go? And in their mind, givers never have a tally sheet. They never have something where it's like, okay, you've given me this, and so I get this, and so this is how this works. Givers don't do this. But that is what characterizes the third kind of people, and these are called matchers. Matchers are those that aim to even up the ledger and give only as much as they take. Now, matchers will take, and they will ultimately reflect oftentimes the culture of what they're brought into. And so if you have a giving environment, they will begin to be more givers because they're matching that thing. If you begin to have a taking environment, they will begin to have people, an orientation towards taking. And it's likely, as you begin to think about this, that you begin to have two things going on. One is you've probably thought, what am I? And the other one is like, I know somebody, most likely in the taker category, right? I know somebody, right? And so I was going to give you a little test that you take, and said, take this for someone that you know, right? And to be able to say, hey, these are some of these questions that they begin to process. We don't have time for that. So in your mind, you just have to take and begin to say, using those definitions, can you begin to have faces that come to those categories? That you begin to say, these are people who are givers. These are people who are absolutely takers, right? And you begin to, those kind of have these emotional moments for us, and you begin to say, yes, I've been around a taker. What he says is, research says that 70% of us are matchers. 70% really are oriented towards the general feeling of the rooms that we're in, the organizations that we're in, our work environment, our social environment, our home environment. To be able to say, is this home environment a giving or a taking kind of mentality to them? Now he said, what happens is that love tends to change these things, and it tends to morph these towards giving. And in this, as you begin to think through this, it's really key for us to be able to differentiate between the difference. He says there's givers, takers, and matchers, but oftentimes they get subtly put into another way of thinking, which he calls agreeableness, agreeable and disagreeable. So agreeable people are people that tend to appear cooperative and polite. They seek harmony with others and come across as warm, nice, and welcoming. Disagreeable people tend to be more competitive, critical, and tough. They're more comfortable with conflict and coming across as skeptical and challenging. And so here's the stereotype that we tend to think, that agreeable people equal givers and disagreeable people equal takers. But what he says is this, there's this veneer of how you act outside of people that actually doesn't have any kind of reference point to your internal motivations towards the world around you. And so what happens, he says, they're basically agreeable givers and disagreeable takers are only two of the kind of ideas that we have. So if you think about this in a grid, and you begin to think about agreeableness, and you begin to have, giving and taking, disagreeable, agreeable, giving and taking. He's like, only two of these exist, right? So if you have an agreeable giver and a disagreeable taker, there's also these other realities. That is a disagreeable taker. So that's those people, that's what we are. There's this agreeable taker, right? And an agreeable taker is what he would say is a faker. an agreeable taker, they appear to be nice. They are someone who comes across as like, man, this is so great, we're so cooperative. But at the end, what they are actually seeking is to leverage this for their own good, not for your good. And so what comes across as someone who wants to be helpful to you or wants to be connected to you is actually someone who wants to use you. But the other side of this is this idea of being able to be a disagreeable giver. This person that has this aspect of being able to say, hey, they're kind of crusty, they're kind of prickly, but actually once you get past this, they are solid gold. Like they're one of these people that they're not an agreeable personality, but they're actually someone who is out for your good. And so here's the thing. When we begin to look at this, and we begin to see how this plays out, I think it's really key. And here's why I say all of this stuff to be able to illustrate this, is that oftentimes what can happen in the church is we believe that there's this kind of veneer of being nice to people. And the idea of we should be kind and we should be, someone who's outwardly nice. What happens is that when we use that as the standard of community, when we use that as the standard for how we serve people, what you begin to see is when it plays out, you begin to have someone who actually seems like a faker in that moment. And so what we have to understand, and this is just the best way I can illustrate this, that real is more significant than nice. That when we talk about what it looks like, actually our behaviors of serving each other are more important than our veneer of being nice or kind or considerate. That when we begin to say, hey, what makes a difference in how people from the outside see those who are insiders is actually the behavior and the impact. Unfortunately, the church has had for years this misunderstanding of service of each other. And ultimately, it gets said, hey, these are a bunch of hypocrites. And that's because at the core, there's a missing piece oftentimes to how we actually operate with each other that is sacrificial, that is servant-oriented, that is putting each other ahead of ourselves. And so what happens is when we begin to see this, we begin to understand really how it begins to work itself out. And so let me just give you some hey, this is kind of the moments that we get to see. When we begin to operate towards being able to be real and to be honest and for us to be able to think about what it takes for us to overcome that, oftentimes we begin to shortcut the process of being able to find deep community and to be able to reveal a kind of service that looks like Jesus because we shortcut that because we think, I don't want to ask them for a favor. I don't want to put them out. I don't want to be needy. And it's ultimately based upon pride. And what pride does is it silos us. But when we begin to overcome our pride and begin to say, hey, I have this need, and I have this thing that I need some help in, is that when we push towards this, we begin to get past nice, we get past veneer and we get into real. And what happens when you get into real is you discover who people are. And what I love is the diversity that we have across our church, across the family of God, the kingdom of God. And we get to see that God has created all of these incredible people that are all different and they all have these different passions. And when we begin to take and we begin to explore what it means to serve each other, what happens is that we draw out the passions, we draw out the gifts. And so let me give you an illustration of this. When we serve, it unlocks those things and we never know what's on the other side of an ask. So our church is growing and we're taking Jesus, commands and we're doing them and we're trying to create what I believe Jesus intended for the church. And we're going and making disciples. And when you get disciples, you get the church. And when you start making disciples in other places, you plant churches. And so we get to see these churches on college campuses across the Northwest. And as we begin to see what's going on in the next couple years, man, it's just incredible to see what happens when you begin to believe Jesus multiplications, and begin to take his words seriously. And what we're seeing is this expansion. And I've been praying and asking God, what do we do, and what does this look like? And as we begin to see further and further out, begin to recognize, man, I don't want to be absent from my house, and yet there's a connection that needs to happen, and begin to say, okay, what does it look like for us to be connected together? What does it look like for me to see all these people spread out? And so I began to pray this outrageous prayer. God, maybe we need an airplane. What are we going to do with all of this thing? We need a pilot. And typically, if you say, okay, when preachers start talking about airplanes, that's an issue, right? There's a pinky ring and a white suit coming somewhere, right? So I was like, it just needs to be a really ugly airplane, Jesus. And so this is this, and I begin to say, okay, and everyone's thinking I'm crazy, mainly my family, when I say everyone. And I'm just saying, okay, what does it look like? How do we begin to see, how do we have this connection with people as we begin to have this geographic diversity? And what is it going to look like for me not to be on the road all the time and yet be connected? And so I just begin to say, okay, who do I know that can help me out with this? And there's a guy that I met, and this guy owns hundreds of apartment units in another state, and owns multiple airplanes, and just like his significance is a factor of 10 above mine. And so in terms of his time and in terms of his wealth and in terms of all this, but he's a kingdom-minded kind of dude. And so I was like, I'm gonna email him, and I'm gonna ask him. And so I emailed him, and he replied back like within 24 hours. And he writes me this really long email. But here's what happens. He starts off the email, and he says this: "Thank you, Keith, for asking me about one of my favorite things in the world. That's aviation." And I thought, this is like, I'm thinking it's gonna be a long shot for me to have a 5-minute conversation with this dude. He says, "Can I figure out how to call you? And can we talk through this?" And then he calls me the next day. We talked for 2 hours. And here's what I want to say. I didn't know on the other side the passion that he had to be able to help. And it wasn't until I lowered my pride and said, okay, I'm just gonna make an ask. I think I might have this need, and it's an outrageous, so I just try to figure out what's the most outrageous need I have. I'm gonna tell you guys about this. And this guy responds and says, hey, I wanna tell you all of what you need to know. And so, and then he's like calling the Pullman airport to figure out what planes that they have to rent. He's like, because this is key to figure out if you can do this or not. And I'm like, you are a busy dude. This is way below your pay grade. And I want you to get that each and every one of you, if someone were to take and to be able to ask you, hey, this is your passion. If someone were to ask you, can you help me inside of the passion that you have? Man, that would unlock something within you, right? And there would be something that you would say, man, I'm so happy to help. I'm so happy to be able to participate in this. And what happens in this is when we begin to do this together, when we begin to serve, what looks like radical service is really just the drawing out of the passions and the giftedness. And so, man, there's been so many times where someone has helped me with something that would seem crazy to me, and it's a passion of theirs, right? And it's so difficult for me, and they can begin to say, man, I love doing this. I want to do this. I want to serve in this kind of way. And our family has been deeply blessed over and over and over by people. And what's so crazy is this idea that they return back and say, it's my pleasure. And so what happens is we begin to unlock the joy within us when we begin to have this kind of radical commitment to each other that looks like family, that we begin to say, hey, instead of indulging, I'm going to serve. Instead of being a taker, I'm going to be a giver. Instead of being a matcher, I'm going to ultimately become a giver. And when we begin to see this, what happens is we begin to play this reality out. And so here's what it says. in Philippians chapter 2. It says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourself, not looking for your own interest, but each of you to the interest of others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. And so here's this reality. So if you begin to think, okay, how do I become a giver? Because oftentimes how we operate is in a zero-sum kind of mentality. That if I give, that means there's a loss. And if I take, that means there's a gain. As if these things are connected. And this zero-sum thing is in our mind, us keeping the tally sheet, that I can't just be a giver because I'll get run over. I'll become a doormat. There'll be something that happens. Now, really quick, let me go back. He says, that can happen. Adam Grant says, not Paul. And he says, takers, when you look at productivity, are in the middle of the sector, or the middle of the kind of the curve. What you have on either side is the lowest performing people are the givers who operate as doormats. But also you have the most significant people in terms of being able to be productive, accelerating, are actually the givers as well. And when you begin to think about what it looks like to be able to give and not believe that you're operating in a zero-sum game, that if you give, it's a loss to you, this begins to operate in a radically new way. And when you begin to see this idea that makes sense to us, right? We hear giver, taker, matcher. That's a biblical idea, right? In terms of how it looks. The problem is at the end of his book, he has no real content to be able to say, here's why you're a giver. Basically, he says, you could become the most highest performing person if you're a giver. Ironically, that's the mindset of a taker. Here's what we begin to see, the brilliance of the gospel. Because what we begin to see is Jesus who takes, and he's making himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant. And so he begins to be obedient even to death on a cross. And I want you to get that on the cross of Christ, what happens is we as his children become people who have been given to such a deep degree, that we have been given in a way that is radically, just never able to be matched by us. So we can never ever say, I did this and it matched Jesus' gift to me. So when we begin to say, as a body of believers, how is it that we can be people that are not just matchers, but we become the radical service-oriented people who are connected into a kind of community that is committed and lives sacrificially because we have a sacrifice that's been made for us in Jesus Christ on the cross. And that sacrifice has given us with immeasurable grace, and that we receive from Christ. And so again, we can bend out the vertical to the horizontal and begin to understand that there's no way we can ever pay back Jesus for the gift that he's given to us. Therefore, we should not think about others that are around us and being able to say, I'm only gonna live towards you in the context that you can pay me back for this. Because the mindset, it says being in the very same mindset of Jesus, is us being able to understand the way that Christ lived towards us is to say, I'm gonna sacrifice everything for your good. And when we begin to live that out towards other people, this is the brilliance of something that makes no sense to the world around us. This is the essence of everything good and right and just that we fight for. And when we taste it, we begin to say, I want more of that. And it begins to lead us to this. But the reality is we are people who ultimately see ourselves as people who are matched by this reality that zero sum is zero fun. And that the joy that we have is when we find that Jesus at the cross, it draws us to match him instead of others. That we begin to see the cross draws us to match Jesus. And we begin to say, it's because of Jesus that I operate towards this. That my motivation is not because you deserve it, but because God has done something in me. And then we become givers. And we become people who are ultimately operating towards each other and beginning to say, I'm not going to carry a tally sheet. And that is how the foundations of the Christian church was built. You read Acts, and these people are insanely generous. Why? Because they're discovering that they have discovered a gift. They have discovered that they have been given something. And they're like, you can take all my stuff. We'll have a common fund, and I'll sell the stuff, and we'll give it to anyone who has need. And that radical idea began to transform the way by which they saw each other. It still does. I want you to get how, as we begin to see the world around us, I got to consult with a church in New York City. And this church in New York City has a group of people called the Gotham Fellowship. And they're a part of a church called Redeemer there. And what happens is they gather as businessmen and women of, if you're working in Manhattan, right, it's probably high pressure, high significance in terms of just being able to have the jobs that typify there. But what happens is this group of people is significantly different than anyone else around them. And this group of people is trying to figure out, how do I not just accelerate myself, but how do I accelerate others? And as people begin to be a part of this, what happens is the body of Christ, in the context of just their business world, becomes radically accelerant to both their fellowship, their needs, their careers, and they begin to see people who are saying, hey, this is how I can help you in your context, and they're crossing over between jobs and industries and being able to say, I have these connections here, I can make this phone call here. And what happens is it's not because of anything else, but the fact that they become someone who says, I'm gonna give to others. And as they begin to describe this, and they begin to describe, hey, this is what it looks like when Christians begin to live around each other. The depth of their community, the depth of their even acceleration in their careers and their acceleration in their industry begins to happen because they begin to operate towards each other in ways that use all of the resources of the community to help all of the people of the community. It's incredible. It's incredible to see these things, and I could tell you stories after stories of this. But I want to see this happen in our context, where people would say, "Hey, the way by which you guys accelerate each other and serve each other and sacrifice for each other, man, that's just objectively incredible." And so one of the things that they do to try to help people to start acting this way is they call the circle of service. And people will gather around, and in conference rooms, they'll say, hey, look, we need our team to be able to serve each other. And so what they'll do is they'll go around and they'll say, hey, what is a need that you have? Or what's something that you're trying to get? And they'll say, maybe I'm trying to get an internship at Disneyland or something like that, random, right? And they begin to say, the people around them begin to say, hey, how can I help you with that? How can I be a part of that? And I know someone, I can make a call. And you begin to see, and person after person says, hey, this is one of the things that I have. This is one of the needs that might be a part of my life. Is there anything that can begin to accelerate? And we begin to have this awesome opportunity to be able to say, these are the things that I can bring to serve and to be a giver. So what if this week, one of the goals is for us to have this connection to community, that we're believing that church happens in circles, not in rows. And so we're asking all of you guys to be pressed into the circles called villages, house churches, missional communities, so that we begin to see what it looks like for us to be able to experience. And what if this week, that's just one of the things that you guys did, and you begin to say, I need an airplane, and I need a pilot. Anybody have one of those laying around? Right? And you begin to say, maybe not absurd things like that, right? But maybe, this is these amazing things about what it looks like for us to be able to say, hey, I have a need. Is anybody, and what if we begin to operate towards each other like that? College students, I want to challenge you to take, and would you spend time with people that are outside of college? Would you serve them? Like, we got a lot of kids in our church. What if you begin to say, how is it that I can provide childcare for a village? How is it that I can begin to say, hey, I want to be a part of your house? The good thing is that you get to be a part of people who maybe are a little bit better at adulting than you are. And you can begin to kind of understand, hey, this is what it looks like. And we begin to see the body of Christ being pulled together. And I would say, man, if you were to say to a couple, hey, can I keep your kids so that you guys can go on a date? I mean, that's way, way up there on the like, you've just changed my life, right? Can I watch your kids so that you guys can have fellowship with another couple? Would you do that? Would you press into that? And would we be people that begin to be givers because we have been deeply given to? And it changes the context of how we create community because we serve each other well.